Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of our podcast, The Secret Lives of. Today, we will be taking a look into the secret life of meat. We will discuss how meat as a commodity has shifted to a mass industry in the U.S. during the Industrial Revolution, as well as the current role of meat in American culture and anti-veganism. We will lastly address the social and environmental impacts of large-scale factory farming as it exists currently. Today, over lunch, we will be recreating a conversation that some, but not enough of us, are having about the food we eat.
I'm so hungry.
Me too.
What'd you guys bring for lunch?
I brought a turkey sandwich.
I have a quinoa salad with tofu.
Tofu? Are you a vegan?
I try not to eat meat most of the time, but there's actually so many great plant-based options nowadays.
I just don't get it. Eating meat is part of our history, and it's a natural human activity.
Yeah, it's true that we were all once hunter-gatherers, then home and local farmers, but we cannot compare the meat we eat now to the meat we ate 200 years ago.
Why not?
Back in Europe, prior to the 20th century, the growing of livestock was often organized in a way that funneled meat straight to the wealthy or the landed aristocracy. In the U.S., though, meat was much easier to find. Grazing lands were close to cities, sometimes right inside cities. Increased productivity of slaughterhouses during the Industrial Revolution, as well as cheap labor, meant meat was widely accessible and affordable in the U.S.
Oh, kind of like how tea transitioned from being an elite commodity to a common good across Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
We talked about tea using exploitative labor. Is the meat industry that bad?
Well, yeah. During the stockyard era, which began in Chicago in 1865, it marked a huge shift for the meat industry and our relationship as Americans to meat. Governments wanted to make animal slaughter less visible. Ironically, the new slaughterhouses, which were labeled as public, quote unquote, increasingly removed animal slaughter from the view of the general public. There's no longer that human connection with the animal, raising it up yourself and slaughtering it to provide for your family, or even buying from a local butcher. The majority of people were completely removed from the process. And this can be said about all kinds of commodities, clothing, growing your own produce. Humans are more disconnected from the processes of the things we use today than ever before. The meat industry during the stockyard era relied heavily on a workforce of immigrants and racial minorities, as well as women. There was a subsequent shift in the workforce composition, and by the mid-20th century, the majority of slaughterhouse workers were white men. As of 2020, though, only 34.5% of slaughterhouse workers in the U.S. were white, and we again rely heavily on an immigrant workforce. There are other human rights and workers' issues in the slaughterhouse industry. The illness and injury rate of workers was higher in slaughterhouses than in any other industry for much of the last quarter of the 20th century. These workers experience high rates of carpal tunnel, mental health issues, and even PTSD. A 2009 study by Fitzgerald et al. Found that slaughterhouse employment increases total arrest rates, arrests for violent crimes, arrests for rape, and arrests for other sex offenses in comparison with other industries.
Well, every big industry has its inequalities, but Americans love meat. What else would you eat on Thanksgiving or the 4th of July? Meat is an important part of our culture.
Do you ever wonder why eating meat is so American?
No, I've never really thought about it, to be honest.
Well, the stockyard era for mass meat production was built for maximum profit. Despite the inequities to workers in the surrounding neighborhoods, governments and corporations promote sales to ensure a steady increase in profit. We even see governments promoting meat as a healthy commodity. Do you guys remember the food pyramid from elementary school?
Of course.
I think so.
Yeah. So, the food pyramid, which originally was released in 1984 and removed in 2011, was sponsored by the USDA to show what a healthy diet is supposed to consist of. But there was a lot of criticism about the absence of a top-line message about limiting red and processed meat. Spokespeople from the American Cancer Society criticized these guidelines, and studies have repeatedly linked heavy meat consumption to higher rates of heart disease, premature death, and cancer. Another professional, Dr. Frank Hu at Harvard, says the meat industry has historically had a huge influence on the USDA. And in 2016, Dr. Marion Nestle, author of Food Politics and former chair of the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health at NYU, says there's a great deal of money at stake in what these guidelines say. I was told we could never say, eat less meat, because the USDA would not allow it. So we need to think about who is really benefiting. As productivity and sales increased for mass production and cheap labor, profits skyrocketed, and corporations and governments were making that profit. So why would they stop? The interest of the government and corporations is inextricably linked. Farming is also another large part of American culture. And those ideas are reinforced through meat packaging, which appeals to this idea of fresh, homegrown American meat and dairy with pictures of happy cows and family-run farms. But this is not the reality for the majority of the meat we eat. So, why is choosing to not eat meat seen as so anti-American? So, why is choosing meat seen as anti-American? Basically, eating meat is participating in our capitalist society. So choosing to not eat meat means rejecting that capitalist agenda.
I hear what you're saying, but there's such a big stigma around veganism, and I don't want to be the other.
Why is veganism so controversial?
Well, people don't want their morals challenged. And one of these morals is the concept of speciesism. So, how do we determine which species is worthy of life? Is it the way they look, their intelligence level, how easily domesticated they are? Why do we deem a human evil for slaughtering a dog, but we celebrate the slaughter of pigs, chickens, cows, fish, etc.? How do we quantify one being worthy of life? I think that the same could be asked of humans. Why do we deem some people worthy of freely entering our country's borders while other families are detained and parents are separated from their children? Where does this bias come from, and is it truly justified? This tension emerges as we continue to consume animal products in abundance, but psychologically, many of us experience feelings of guilt, shame, and disgust when we think, as little as possible, about the industrial processes by which domestic animals are rendered into products and how those products come to the market. And even if the method of slaughter is deemed humane by the corporation, factory animals are subject to complete denial of a natural life, and they're forced to undergo painful procedures without pain medication, including beak removal, tail removal, forced impregnation, teeth removal, antler and horn removal. These are all painful, common, and legal practices used so that the animals do not attack each other or workers while forced to live in such confined spaces. Why do you guys think we take kids to the pumpkin patch and the apple orchard, but not to the slaughterhouse? Probably because we don't want anyone to see it. Philosopher Nancy William argues that there's actually an unwillingness among the public to think about how their meat is produced, and that this has important ethical implications. She characterizes this unwillingness as affected ignorance, whereby a choice is made to not investigate whether a practice one is involved in is immoral.
I've never really thought too much about what happens before my food's on my plate. It's kind of like how we still buy fast fashion and use plastic cups, even though we know it has a severe impact on our environment.
Yeah, exactly. But sadly, the environmental impact of meat is pretty detrimental too. About 71% of rainforest conversion in South America has been for cattle ranching, and a further 14% for commercial cropping, which includes soy for animal feed. Water pollution is also a big issue with animal agriculture. Nitrogen and phosphorus in animal manure contribute to nutrient loads in surface and groundwater, harming aquatic ecosystems and human health. Plastic products, which became mass-produced after World War II, also strongly helped the meat industry grow in productivity. Plastic meant that meat could be portioned, packaged, and preserved for longer travel and distribution. Animal agriculture releases a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Methane is 25 to 100 times more destructive and has a warming potential 86 times greater than CO2. Livestock and their byproducts account for at least 32,000 million tons of carbon dioxide per year, or 51% of all worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. Livestock is the greatest contributor of atmospheric methane, the second most potent greenhouse gas. Animal agriculture is also very water intensive. One hamburger is 2,400 liters of embedded water. Can you guys believe that?
Jeez.
Further, livestock uses 83% of farmland, yet it provides just 18% of the food calories and 37% of protein required by humans. Lastly, more than half of the US grain and nearly 40% of world grain is being fed to livestock rather than being consumed directly by humans.
Maybe I should think more about what I eat, but where do I even start? Cooking without animal products feels intimidating.
You know, I felt the same way when I started eating plant-based, but luckily there's so many more options now than there used to be.
In the grocery store, I even see whole aisles that are full of vegan options or organic options, which is a great shift.
Yeah, I notice every year more options coming out. So, other ways you can help, other than just like fully transitioning to a vegan diet, just understand that it doesn't need to be all or nothing. You know, one meal a day would help, or even one meal a week. So start small and just increase the amount of plant-based meals you have per week. It also helps to just have conversations with people, do your own research, and when you do buy meat, try to buy less and try to buy local. It's also important to acknowledge that not everyone has the privilege to eat vegan, and if you have the access to eat fresh fruits and veggies and plant-based protein, maybe you should try to eat a little more of that, but not everyone can do that, so do it if you have the privilege to.
When I first went vegetarian, I looked at other cultures that had a history of being vegan or vegetarian because they had a lot more experience of what to do and how to flavor it to be still a delicious meal, because a lot of people are worried that without meat there's not going to be a lot of salt or flavor, and that's not true.
And of course, it always helps to have someone do it with you. So if you can convince someone to, cook a plant-based meal with you, it makes it a lot more fun and you feel less alone in the process.
I don't know that I can embrace veganism anytime soon, but I could definitely switch to a flexitarian diet.
Yeah, like I said, it doesn't need to be all or nothing. We all need to think more about the things we consume, and a step in the right direction is still a step closer to where we want to be. Thank you guys for having this conversation with me. Join us for our third and final installation of the podcast as we look into the secret life of consumer waste.